I walked into the office that Tuesday morning the same way I had for the past 18 years. Coffee in hand, black, 2 sugars, nodding to Marcus at security, checking my emails before the day officially started. The familiar rhythm of corporate life. Badge scan, elevator to the 3rd floor, settle into the cubicle I'd occupied longer than most people stay married. I had no idea it would be my last morning as an employee. The morning started normally enough. Project status reports, client emails, the usual Tuesday team meeting that could have been an email. Then my computer chimed with a calendar notification. Meeting with Sarah Martinez, Conference Room B, 9:15 a.m. I glanced at the notification with mild curiosity. Sarah had only been COO for 3 days. What could she possibly need to discuss that couldn't wait for our regular monthly review? Sarah Martinez had just taken over as Chief Operating Officer 3 days earlier. 28 years old, fresh MBA from Wharton, and carrying herself like she owned the world. Which, technically, she did. Her father, Robert Martinez, had built this engineering consulting firm from nothing back in 1987. Started in his garage with one computer and a dream of revolutionizing infrastructure design. Now we had 47 employees and offices in 3 cities. The main headquarters here in Denver, a satellite office in Phoenix, and a small but growing operation in Seattle. Robert was 65 now, ready to step back and play more golf. His doctor had been after him for years to reduce his stress levels, and the recent mild heart episode 6 months ago had finally convinced him to take succession planning seriously. Sarah was supposed to be his carefully groomed successor, emphasis on supposed to be. I'd watched her grow up in a way. Summer internships during high school where she'd file paperwork and make copies. Part-time work during college when she'd help with basic data entry and client communication. Then increasingly important roles after graduation. Junior project manager, senior account coordinator, department supervisor. She was smart, no question about that. Driven, ambitious, full of ideas about modernization and efficiency. But there's a difference between being smart and being wise. Between knowing the theory and understanding the practice. The signs had been there for months. The subtle shift in company culture since she'd been promoted to vice president last year. The new policies about optimizing human resources and leveraging synergies. The mandatory seminars on agile management and disruptive innovation. The way she looked at veteran employees like we were relics of a bygone era rather than repositories of institutional knowledge. She called me into Conference Room B at exactly 9:15 a.m. Punctual, I'll give her that. Robert had always stressed the importance of respecting other people's time, and Sarah had absorbed that lesson well. David, we need to talk. The conference room felt different somehow, colder. Sarah had removed all the pictures Robert kept on the walls. Photos of completed projects, team celebrations. That shot of the whole company at the Christmas party 5 years ago when we'd landed the Henderson contract. Everything personal was gone, replaced by generic motivational posters about synergy and innovation and maximizing potential. The warm, family business atmosphere Robert had cultivated was being systematically erased. I sat down across from her, noting the stack of papers in front of her and the way she wouldn't make eye contact. 18 years of experience teaches you to read a room fast, and this room was screaming termination. The formal setup, the documentation, the way she kept checking her watch as if she had a schedule to maintain. We're restructuring, she said, finally looking up with what I recognized as practiced corporate neutrality. Your position is being eliminated. I kept my expression neutral, though my mind was already racing through the implications. I see. We could bring in 3 junior engineers for your salary. Nothing personal, just budget optimization. The company needs to modernize, become more agile in today's competitive marketplace. Agile. One of those buzzwords that sounds impressive in presentations but usually means cheaper in practice. I'd heard her use it at least a dozen times in the past month during various meetings and strategy sessions. I should have felt angry, should have argued about my track record, my client relationships, the projects I'd personally saved from disaster over nearly 2 decades. The Morrison account that was bleeding money until I restructured their entire workflow and brought them back from the brink of bankruptcy. The Henderson project that would have collapsed without my personal intervention when their original contractor went under. The Peterson facility design that won industry awards and brought in 3 additional major clients. The 12 active projects currently bearing my signature and expertise. Instead, I felt oddly calm. Maybe it was shock, or maybe it was the recognition that this moment had been building since Sarah started making changes. The new office layout that eliminated the collaborative spaces Robert had insisted on. The mandatory efficiency seminars that felt more like indoctrination sessions. The pointed comments about dead weight and fresh thinking during staff meetings. The way she'd been gradually marginalizing senior employees while promoting younger staff members who shared her vision of innovation. "When do you need me out?" Sarah looked slightly surprised by my composure. She'd probably expected pushback, emotional outbursts, maybe threats to call her father. "Today, HR will handle your final paperwork. Security will escort you out once you've cleared your desk." She slid a termination letter across the polished conference table. I glanced at it quickly. Standard boilerplate language. Nothing about my actual employment contract. Just a generic severance offer that barely covered 2 months of expenses. Clearly, someone had pulled this from a template without bothering to review my specific situation or the protections Robert had insisted on when we negotiated my last contract renewal. "Thanks for the opportunity," I said, standing up and extending my hand. Sarah shook it, though she looked confused by my calm reaction. Maybe she expected shouting, pleading, or dramatic declarations about loyalty and service. Instead, I gathered my dignity, straightened my tie, and walked out of the conference room with my head held high. The news spread through the office like wildfire. By the time I reached my desk, half the department was staring with expressions ranging from shock to outrage. Tom from accounting pulled me aside in the hallway, his face red with indignation and his voice lowered to an urgent whisper. "This is insane, David. You practically built half our client relationships from scratch. The Morrison contract alone brings in $2.3 million annually, and that's your baby. You saved their entire operation." "It's her company now," I replied, beginning to pack my personal items methodically. "She gets to make these calls." "But 18 years of service? The Henderson project that put us on the map? That fire safety consulting contract you landed last month that's worth $800,000 over 3 years?" I looked at Tom. Good man, been with the company almost as long as me, worked his way up from junior bookkeeper to head of accounting. Change happens. Sometimes it's necessary. But inside, I was already thinking about the contract sitting in my home office safe. The one her father and I had negotiated 5 years ago during my last major promotion. The one that included some very specific clauses Sarah had apparently never bothered to read, despite her MBA and all those seminars about due diligence. The packing process was methodical and oddly therapeutic. 18 years of accumulated professional life. Awards from industry associations, photos from project completions, that coffee mug my team gave me after we saved the Henderson project from a complete meltdown. The small potted plant Jennifer from marketing had given me 3 Christmases ago. Business cards from clients who'd become friends over the years. A paperweight from the Phoenix office opening. The little desk calendar my wife bought me every year with pictures of Colorado landscapes. Jennifer stopped by as I was wrapping the plant in newspaper, her eyes red with barely contained tears. "This isn't right," she whispered, glancing around to make sure Sarah wasn't within earshot. "You mentored half the people in this building." "Change happens," I repeated, though part of me appreciated her loyalty. "Sometimes it's necessary. But you trained half the people here. Remember when I started? I was terrified, convinced I was going to fail spectacularly. You spent 2 weeks showing me the ropes, stayed late to help me catch up on the Peterson account when I was drowning." I remembered. Jennifer had been a nervous wreck those first few weeks, convinced she was in over her head. Fresh out of college, intimidated by the corporate environment, struggling to understand our client management software. Now she was one of our best account managers, handling relationships worth millions of dollars. "You'll be fine," I told her. "The team is solid. You'll adapt." Sarah walked past my cubicle twice during the packing process, probably checking to make sure I wasn't causing a scene or bad-mouthing her to the remaining staff. Each time, I gave her a polite nod. Professional to the end. No point in burning bridges or creating drama that would only make things harder for my former colleagues. Marcus from security appeared around 11:30 a.m. with an apologetic expression that told me he was as uncomfortable with this as I was. Sorry, David. Just following protocol. No worries, Marcus. Just doing your job. Marcus had been with the company for 12 years, hired after his military service when Robert decided we needed better security protocols. Good man, fair, treated everyone with respect regardless of their position in the hierarchy. By noon, I was in my car, driving home with a cardboard box in the back seat containing the remnants of my corporate identity. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from colleagues expressing shock and support. I ignored them all. No point in rehashing the situation or building resentment among people who still had to work there and needed to maintain their relationships with the new management. At home, I made a simple sandwich, turkey and Swiss, nothing fancy, and sat down at my kitchen table with my employment contract. 23 pages of legal language that Robert and I had hammered out during lengthy negotiations 5 years earlier. I'd just been promoted to senior engineering consultant, and Robert wanted to lock me in with a comprehensive agreement that protected both parties and recognized my growing value to the organization. He understood my worth then. He'd fought to keep me when Hendrix Engineering tried to poach me with a 30% salary increase. He'd recognized that experience and client relationships don't just appear overnight, that there's real value in institutional knowledge and established trust. Sarah clearly had a different perspective on what constituted valuable human capital. Page 14 contained the section I was looking for. Under Termination Provisions, subsection C. Involuntary termination without cause requires 90 days written notice and triggers consultant retainer agreement per addendum F. I flipped to addendum F, scanning the dense legal language I'd nearly forgotten about in the years since signing. There it was, in black and white. If I was terminated without cause, I automatically became a retained consultant at 70% of my current salary for a minimum of 2 years. The company was also required to honor my existing client relationships and pay my standard consulting rate for any projects I'd initiated that remained active. My standard consulting rate, as specified in the contract, was $180 per hour, substantially higher than my effective hourly employee wage when you factored in all the unpaid overtime and weekend work that came with being a salaried professional. I walked to my home office and pulled out the project files I kept for insurance purposes. 12 active projects with my signature on them, each one representing months or years of relationship building, technical expertise, and client trust. The Morrison account restructuring that had taken 8 months to design and implement. The Henderson safety audit that required specialized knowledge of industrial regulations. The new Peterson facility design that was only halfway through the approval process. Each project was legally tied to my personal oversight according to the client contracts. Sarah had just cost her company roughly $400,000 in mandatory consulting fees, plus my retained consultant salary of $98,000 annually for 24 months. All because she wanted to save money on my $140,000 employee salary and replace me with junior staff earning a third of that amount. The math was staggering when I really thought about it. Instead of paying me $140,000 per year as an employee, with benefits, vacation time, sick leave, and all the overhead costs, she'd committed the company to paying me roughly $300,000 annually in consulting fees and retainer for 2 full years. With no benefits costs, no office space, no equipment, and no management overhead. I called my lawyer, Mike Brennan, who'd handled my contract negotiations and various legal matters for over a decade. Sharp mind, reasonable rates, and completely trustworthy. The kind of attorney who actually read the fine print and explained it in plain English. David, good to hear from you. How's that retirement planning going? Change of plans, Mike. I need you to review a termination letter against my employment contract. I scanned both documents and emailed them over while we stayed on the line, sipping my coffee and watching my neighbor work in his garden. Retirement was looking more appealing by the minute. 20 minutes later, Mike called back, and I could hear the amazement in his voice mixed with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. David, did this woman actually read your contract? Apparently not. She just triggered the most expensive severance clause I've ever written. Congratulations. You're about to make more money unemployed than you did employed. How much more? Based on your current project load and the retainer terms, roughly double your previous income. Maybe triple if you factor in the hourly consulting rates for ongoing project management. Mike went on to explain the legal implications. The contract was ironclad. Robert had insisted on that when we negotiated it. Any attempt to challenge or void the consulting agreement would likely result in additional damages and legal fees. Sarah's termination letter actually strengthened my position by documenting that I was fired without cause and without the required 90-day notice. I spent the rest of that week organizing my home office and updating my consulting business registration, something I'd maintained for occasional side work but never expected to need as a primary income source. No point in rushing. The contract was clear. They had to honor the terms regardless of when I invoked them. The silence from the office was telling. No calls, no emails, no attempts to negotiate or clarify the situation. Sarah had made her decision and apparently considered it final. Robert was on his planned fishing trip to Alaska, something he'd been looking forward to for months as his first real vacation in years. He had no idea what his daughter had done in his absence. I used the time productively. Updated my resume, not that I'd need it for a while. Organized my project files for easier reference. Set up a proper home office with better lighting and ergonomic furniture. Called my accountant to discuss the tax implications of consulting income. Even started reading some of the business books I'd been meaning to get to for years. Friday morning, my phone rang. Robert Martinez, calling from somewhere near Anchorage with what sounded like poor cell reception. "David, what the hell happened?" His voice was tight with anger, but I could tell it wasn't directed at me. Background noise suggested he was outside. Probably stepped away from his fishing group to make this call after hearing the news from someone back at the office. "Your daughter terminated my position on Tuesday. Without talking to me? Without reviewing your contract? Without any kind of consultation or transition planning?" She mentioned budget optimization, 3 junior engineers for the price of 1 senior consultant. Robert was quiet for a long moment. I could hear wind and what sounded like water lapping against a dock. When he spoke again, his voice was strained. "Have you invoked the consultant clause yet?" "Not yet." "Don't. Please, let me handle this when I get back Sunday. We can work something out." But I'd already made my decision during those quiet days at home, thinking through 18 years of loyalty and dedication, weighing it against being dismissed like an obsolete piece of equipment. "I'm sorry, Robert. The termination already happened. The contract is clear about next steps." Another pause. Longer this time. "How much is this going to cost me?" According to my lawyer, roughly $600,000 over 2 years, plus project-specific consulting fees. I heard him curse under his breath, words I'd never heard him use in 18 years of working together. Robert had always been professional, measured, careful with his language even in stressful situations. "I'll call you back." The call ended abruptly. I imagined Robert standing on some pristine Alaskan dock, staring at his phone and calculating exactly how much his daughter's impulsive decision would cost the company he'd spent decades building. Monday morning brought chaos I could only observe from a comfortable distance. Tom from accounting called me at 8 a.m., his voice hushed but excited with the kind of office drama that normally would have made me uncomfortable but now seemed merely interesting. "You've got to hear this. Sarah and her dad are in the conference room screaming at each other. Everyone can hear them through the walls. I think she just figured out what she did." Through the office grapevine, Jennifer, Tom, even Marcus the security guard, I learned the details over the following days. Robert had spent his weekend flight home with lawyers on conference calls, discovering exactly what Sarah's impulsive decision would cost. He'd arrived at the office Sunday night and spent hours reviewing contracts and consulting agreements, probably realizing for the first time that his daughter had never actually read the employment documents she was so eager to terminate. The consulting retainer alone would eat most of the salary savings Sarah had bragged about in her department meeting. The project fees would push them into the red for the quarter. Worse, my client relationships weren't easily transferable. The Morrison account had specifically requested me for their upcoming expansion project. Henderson Industries had a contract clause requiring my personal oversight for their safety audit. Peterson Construction was halfway through a complex design process that would be nearly impossible to hand off to someone new without significant delays and cost overruns. Sarah had called an emergency meeting with the department heads Monday morning, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. But contracts don't care about buyer's remorse, and legal obligations don't disappear because someone regrets their decision. Wednesday, my phone rang again. Sarah this time, her voice dramatically different from the confident tone she'd used during the termination meeting. David, I think there was a misunderstanding. Her voice was smaller now, less confident. The arrogance had been replaced by something that sounded suspiciously like panic, mixed with the dawning realization of consequences. How so? Maybe we can work something out. Bring you back. Pretend this never happened. Full reinstatement with back pay. I looked out my home office window at the garden my wife had been asking me to help with for years. The early spring flowers were just starting to bloom, and I'd actually had time to notice them, to appreciate the changing seasons instead of rushing past them in my daily commute. I don't think so. The consulting thing. We could waive that. Just come back at your old salary, same benefits, same everything. The contract doesn't work that way, Sarah. Once termination is processed, the consulting clause activates automatically. It's not optional or negotiable. But you haven't submitted any invoices yet. Give me time. The truth was, I was enjoying the break more than I'd expected. No morning commute through Denver traffic. No office politics or mandatory meetings about meetings. No rushing to meet arbitrary deadlines set by people who didn't understand the technical complexities involved. I'd read 3 books that week, helped my wife plant new roses in our long-neglected garden, and had lunch with my brother for the first time in months. Friday brought my first official consulting payment, $8,167 for week 1 of my retainer, plus $3,200 in project fees for managing the Morrison account transition. Direct deposit, just like my old salary, but substantially larger. More money for 1 week of consulting than I used to make in 2 weeks as an employee. The Morrison project was particularly satisfying to manage remotely. They'd called me directly, confused about the sudden personnel change, and deeply concerned about continuity on a project that represented a significant portion of their annual capital expenditure. As their contracted consultant, I was able to reassure them and maintain the relationship I'd spent 2 years building from scratch. Sarah called again the following Monday, her voice now edged with something approaching desperation. This is ridiculous. You're billing us more now than we paid you before. I'm billing you exactly what the contract specifies. Nothing more, nothing less. My father says you wrote this contract specifically to trap us. I almost laughed at that accusation. Sarah, your father negotiated every word of that contract. He understood exactly what it meant when we signed it. He insisted on those protective clauses. But you're bankrupting us. Poor decision-making is expensive. My contract just made that cost transparent and immediate instead of hidden in long-term consequences. The truth was, I felt no particular satisfaction in the company's struggle. Robert had been more than a boss. He'd been a mentor, sometimes a friend. We'd worked together through economic downturns, celebrated successful projects, weathered difficult clients and impossible deadlines. He'd trusted me with major accounts and important decisions. He'd supported my professional development and recognized my contributions. But he'd also handed control to someone who made decisions based on arrogance rather than analysis. Someone who saw experienced employees as expensive obstacles rather than valuable assets. Someone who confused cost-cutting with effective management. 3 months into my involuntary consulting career, Jennifer called with an update that was both predictable and sobering. Sarah's been reassigned to business development, she said, using air quotes I could hear in her voice. Your father's back to managing daily operations, at least temporarily. How are things going overall? Honestly, not great. They hired 2 junior engineers like she planned, but client complaints are mounting. Projects are falling behind schedule. The Morrison account is threatening to leave if they don't get consistent senior oversight. The Morrison account was worth $2.3 million annually, nearly 17 times my old salary. Losing it would devastate the company's revenue base. They're asking if you'd consider coming back full-time, Jennifer continued. At what salary? Whatever you want, apparently. Sarah's not involved in the negotiations. I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds, looking at my comfortable home office setup, my flexible schedule, my dramatically reduced stress levels. I'm happy with my current arrangement. And I genuinely was. The consulting work was intellectually challenging without the corporate bureaucracy. I worked from home 3 days a week, traveled to client sites when necessary, and set my own hours. My blood pressure had dropped 20 points according to my last physical. My wife and I had taken a 2-week vacation to Italy, something I'd never been able to do during busy season as an employee. The best part was watching Sarah learn hard lessons about leadership from a comfortable distance. Robert made her personally handle all communication with me regarding project transitions. Every email was carefully polite, professionally written, and subtly desperate. She'd send detailed questions about client preferences, project specifications, vendor relationships. Information that would have taken 5 minutes to get when I was an employee now required formal consultation requests at $180 per hour, with detailed responses that took time to prepare properly. Can you provide a comprehensive overview of the Henderson project timeline and critical milestones? Cost: $540. What are Morrison Industries' specific requirements for the Phase 3 expansion, including technical specifications and regulatory compliance issues? Cost: $720. Which vendors does Peterson Construction prefer for electrical subcontracting, and what are their typical pricing structures? Cost: $360. Each question represented knowledge I'd accumulated over years of relationship building and project management. Knowledge that couldn't be quickly transferred to junior engineers, no matter how bright or eager they were to prove themselves. 6 months after my termination, I received a different kind of call. "David? It's Robert." He sounded older somehow, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes from watching something you've built slowly fall apart. "How are you holding up?" "Honestly, better than I expected. This consulting thing isn't so bad once you get used to it." "I bet." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not preparing Sarah properly, for assuming she'd have sense enough to read contracts before making major personnel decisions, for not being here when she decided to restructure half the company without any understanding of the consequences." I'd been wondering when this conversation would happen. Robert was too good a leader and too decent a man to let the situation fester indefinitely without addressing it directly. "She's young, Robert. Young people make mistakes. That's how they learn. Expensive mistakes. We've lost 3 major clients since you left. The Hensley project is 6 weeks behind schedule and 20% over budget. And we're still paying you more than your old salary to fix problems that wouldn't exist if you'd never left." The Hensley project had been my particular concern from the beginning. Complex industrial retrofitting with tight environmental compliance requirements and aggressive deadlines. The kind of project that required experience and careful attention to regulatory details that junior engineers typically haven't encountered yet. What are you going to do long term? Learn, I guess. Sarah's learning too, whether she wants to or not. This has been a harsh education in the real cost of experience. The call ended with mutual respect intact, though our relationship had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the loyal employee who'd stay late to meet deadlines or take on extra projects without additional compensation. I was a vendor now, with clearly defined deliverables and market rate pricing. Year 1 of consulting netted me $127,000, nearly $10,000 more than my original salary, with half the stress and twice the flexibility. Year 2 looked even better as project fees increased with inflation adjustments built into the contract. Sarah and I developed a working relationship that was professional but distant. She'd learned to read contracts carefully before making major decisions. She'd learned to value institutional knowledge and client relationships over simple cost calculations. Most importantly, she'd learned that leadership decisions have long-term consequences that can't be undone with apologies or good intentions. The company culture changed dramatically, too. The easy camaraderie Robert had fostered over decades gave way to something more formal and hierarchical. Tom retired 6 months after me, triggering his own consultant clause. Apparently, I wasn't the only one with protective contract language built into my employment agreement. Jennifer left for a competitor, taking 2 major accounts with her. The tight-knit organization Robert had built slowly unraveled as experienced employees realized their value wasn't being recognized or protected. The junior engineers Sarah hired were competent enough individually, but they lacked the client relationships and institutional knowledge that comes with years of experience. They could handle technical specifications and follow established procedures, but they struggled with the subtle relationship management and problem-solving expertise that keeps major accounts happy and profitable. Looking back, I don't think Sarah was evil or deliberately malicious. She was inexperienced, impatient, and overconfident, a dangerous combination in any leadership role, but particularly in a service business built on relationships and trust. Her fundamental mistake wasn't firing me specifically, it was failing to understand what she was firing. She saw my salary as an expense to be minimized rather than an investment that generated substantial returns through client relationships and institutional knowledge. The final irony came during my last month of mandatory consulting. Sarah called to discuss transitioning my remaining projects to permanent staff. Essentially the same conversation we could have had 18 months earlier for free. You know, she said, if I could do it over again, you'd read the contract first? I'd ask my father more questions before making major personnel decisions. I'd spend more time understanding what people actually contribute before deciding they're expendable. I'd recognize that experience has real value that isn't always visible on a balance sheet. Growth, I suppose. Expensive growth, but growth nonetheless. Sometimes the most valuable education comes with the highest price tag. My consulting contract expired on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years after that first firing meeting. I sent my final invoice, $12,400 for project closeout and comprehensive documentation, and closed that chapter of my professional life with a sense of completion. Total earnings from termination, $634,000 in consulting fees and retainer payments, plus project-specific billings that added another $180,000. Sarah had wanted to save money by replacing one experienced engineer with 3 junior staff members. Instead, she'd created a 2-year financial drain that cost more than keeping me would have for 5 years. The company learned to function without me eventually. They hired experienced engineers at market rates, paid significant signing bonuses to attract talent with existing client relationships, and spent months rebuilding trust and credibility that had been damaged during the transition period. Sarah matured into a more thoughtful leader, though she never regained the easy confidence she'd displayed during my termination meeting. Robert stepped back gradually instead of all at once, recognizing that leadership transition requires more patience and careful planning than he'd originally anticipated. The company survived and eventually thrived again, but it took nearly 3 years to fully recover from the disruptions Sarah's early decisions had caused. But the lesson remained crystal clear. Experience isn't just about technical knowledge. It's about relationships, institutional memory, problem-solving capability, and the ability to anticipate consequences before they become crises. Good contracts protect both parties by making expectations and obligations explicit. And sometimes the most expensive employee is the one you can't afford to lose carelessly. The story became something of a legend in our industry. I'd occasionally run into former colleagues at conferences or trade shows, and they'd mention how things had finally stabilized at the company, how Sarah had learned to value experience and institutional knowledge, how Robert had found the right balance between innovation and preserving what worked. I retired properly at 62, financially secure thanks to Sarah's expensive lesson in contract law and the value of experience. My wife and I bought a small cabin in the mountains outside Colorado Springs, and I took up woodworking, something I'd always wanted to try but never had time for during my corporate career. The precision and craftsmanship required reminded me of engineering work, but without the deadlines and politics. Sarah sent me a Christmas card that first year of retirement. No long message, just her signature and a simple handwritten note. Thank you for the education. It was expensive, but worth it. I kept that card, not out of spite or vindication, but as a reminder that even painful lessons can lead to growth and better decision-making. Sarah had learned something valuable about leadership, about the real cost of impulsive decisions, about the difference between managing expenses and managing people. 5 years later, I ran into Robert at an industry conference in Las Vegas. He looked healthier, more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. His hair was completely gray now, but he had the easy smile of someone who'd finally found the right balance between work and life. David, how's retirement treating you? Can't complain. The woodworking keeps me busy, and Linda loves having me around to help with the garden. We found a quiet corner in the hotel bar and caught up properly. The company was thriving again, he told me. Sarah had become an excellent leader once she'd learned to value experience alongside innovation. They'd hired a new senior engineering director, someone with 25 years of experience, to handle the major client relationships. She still asks about you sometimes, Robert said, nursing his beer. Wonders if you ever regret not coming back when we offered. No regrets, I said honestly. Everything worked out the way it was supposed to. The Morrison account still talks about you. They've got a new project starting next month, some kind of automated warehouse system. I told Sarah she should call you for consulting. I smiled. My rates have gone up. Robert laughed. I bet they have. You know, in a strange way, what happened was probably the best thing for everyone. Sarah learned lessons she never would have learned otherwise. The company got stronger. And you got the retirement fund you deserved. Expensive lessons tend to be the most memorable ones. The most expensive lesson I ever learned cost me $800,000 and nearly destroyed my relationship with my daughter. But it made both of us better at what we do. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the conference attendees network and make deals around us. These industry events always reminded me why I was happy to be out of the corporate world. You know what the funny thing is? Robert continued. Sarah keeps that termination meeting as a case study now. She uses it in leadership seminars about the importance of understanding what you're actually managing. Really? She calls it the David Martinez incident. Changed her whole approach to personnel decisions. Now she spends weeks reviewing contracts, interviewing stakeholders, understanding the full scope of someone's role before making any changes. That was satisfying to hear. Not because I wanted to be vindicated, but because it meant something positive had come from what could have been a purely destructive experience. How's Jennifer doing? I asked. Good question. She left us about 6 months after you did, remember? Started her own consulting firm. She's doing very well. Has about 15 employees now and handles a lot of the smaller projects we used to take on. And Tom? Still consulting for us part-time. Comes in 3 days a week to handle the accounting transition. His replacement is good, but it took nearly a year to train her on all our systems. It struck me how many ripple effects that one termination meeting had created. My departure had triggered Tom's retirement, which led to Jennifer leaving, which changed the company's staffing model, which affected client relationships, which influenced Sarah's management philosophy. One impulsive decision had reshaped an entire organization.